response that we have to an event. So it could be a physical response, it could be an emotional response.
Trauma is often the result of an overwhelming amount of stress which exceeds a person's ability to either cope or integrate the emotions involved with that experience.
Trauma is stress that overwhelms our capacity to cope. It can be an event that is related to a natural disaster, or it can be related to violence against women or assault.
Trauma is a one-off experience or multiple experiences that someone goes through that has a lasting impact on them in a negative way.
It's the unexpected event that's happened. It's not something that we are anticipating, so it comes as a shock to us. So our system, our body system, is trying to interpret that information, and sometimes we don't have the tools at that moment in time to process that. So it's that response that we have to something that's not expected.
All types of traumatic events, either man-made or natural, can lead to symptoms of post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, or other mental health conditions. As disasters are mostly unpredictable, it can leave its victims in a state of shock. This can create not only psychological distress, but socio-economic distress.
Natural disasters cause trauma because they upheave everything that is safe and precious to you, and also too, you don't feel in control and feel overwhelmed by the impending danger, for example a bushfire, and also too you watch other people close by to you experience loss and trauma as well, so that can be vicarious trauma.
So emergencies and disasters are unique experiences that impact an individual but also impact a community. So when people go through that, the sources of support around them are also going through the same thing, and that can really make it difficult for people to seek what they are looking for, to express what they need to, because they're caring for the people around them as well.
No, you don't have to be directly. It can be indirectly. It can be hearing it on the news that this has happened. It could be remembering an event that was similar to you.
No, you don't have to be directly affected. It could be a family member, so you might be living away from them and they might be talking to you about what's happened. And it's called vicarious trauma, where you also feel a sense of loss of control and helplessness because you can't fix the problem for the person or fix their distress that they're experiencing.
Of course not. You don't need to be directly affected by a disaster to experience that trauma. We know that most recently the bushfires can impact a much broader community than those directly affected, and that can come out as things like anxiety or hypervigilance, and not knowing what to do, not knowing how to express that can really be debilitating at times for people, make it uncomfortable to express their emotions, might be difficulty in sleeping, eating, or bring out some more negative expressions like anger and frustration.
That's a magical question. It's like asking how long's a piece of string. Trauma can be short, it can be long. It can be something that comes up 2, 3, 6 months down the track, or it could be immediate. So there's no exact answer around that. It's what is it going to mean for you, and however that looks for you is how you deal with that.
The length of time that trauma lasts can vary between individuals. Some people can recover within 6 months, while others who have more complex symptoms can take much longer.
Trauma can last quite some time, but it can have sort of peaks and troughs. So when you experience perhaps another stressful event, you can, experience some of the symptoms of the trauma from perhaps when it happened, because it can trigger those past experiences. You can go a long time without being impacted by the trauma, but as you start to make meaning and make sense of it, and you're starting to feel safe, it can emerge then as well, and that's a good time to get support.
Look, trauma can potentially last a whole lifetime, and we certainly see that with children and young people who have experienced trauma. What makes the difference is getting support and having access to appropriate support services for that person that can reduce the impact of trauma.
That's a tricky question, and sometimes we may not notice it, but then there are times where we might be irritable, we might not be eating as we normally have, we might not be eating at all, we may have sleeplessness, we just not feeling ourselves, mood swings. Those can be subtle or it can be really significant, but it's noticing when you don't feel okay.
So you might find that you're feeling quite anxious. So you might have some symptoms of anxiety, feeling quite tight in your chest, being unable to sit still, wanting to get away from people or places. Finding when you talk about the experience, you feel numbness and you're not able to connect with your emotions. You can also experience sort of disconnection from family and friends and isolating yourself.
I think sometimes it's very difficult to identify that you're experiencing trauma, certainly if it's not direct trauma that we've spoken about before. So in the middle of what's going on, sometimes people don't even have the language to identify that this is trauma. So if someone is experiencing some of the things that we've spoken about, it may be worthwhile talking to someone and saying, I'm not sure, I kind of think that this is what it might be, and then be able to just work through it. So it may be something that they can work through relatively quickly. It may take a longer time to be able to do that.
So if you're experiencing trauma, you might have symptoms of anxiety, which can be shortness of breath, feeling overwhelmed, racing thoughts, tightness in your body. You might also experience symptoms of trauma such as flashbacks, so experiencing what happened in the trauma. It might be recent trauma, it might be quite a long time ago, and there might be triggers that you don't expect that happen that sort of take you back to what's happened before. You might also find that you're disconnecting from loved ones, family and friends, isolating quite a bit, and perhaps turning to coping mechanisms that might sort of numb the pain and the feelings for a while but aren't good in the long run, like increasing your alcohol intake, using substances or turning to gambling, for example, as a way to numb things out and cope.
Possibly you'll notice in their behaviours that they'll just seem off, they won't seem themselves. So how do you notice that they're not doing okay? It could be little things again, or it could be something significant.
You can suspect a trauma response if you notice any significant changes in a person's physical, emotional, psychological well-being and functioning. You may witness them experiencing symptoms such as insomnia, nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, memory problems, difficulty concentrating, or even physical symptoms such as gastrointestinal difficulties, nausea, headaches, aches and pains, or an incredible sense of fatigue.
So others around you might be experiencing trauma if they're showing visible signs of distress, crying, anger. They might be expressing hopelessness or fear, a sense of fear. For example, in the bushfires, people might come to community meetings and want certainty about what's happening, but it's very hard to do that when you're in an emergency. In terms of if people have experienced violence or abuse, they may be using coping mechanisms that don't seem helpful but are actually helping the person cope with trauma. So they might be drinking more alcohol than they usually did, or using substances or gambling. You can also tell if you're finding that you can't reach them very often, that they're isolating as well, and also if they're just not functioning like they normally would, so they're having trouble getting to work, or they're avoiding places where the trauma occurred. That's a very natural thing to do, but it can indicate that there's sort of some longer term effects of the event that they experienced.
Know what works for you. Know that those tools that you might have in your toolbox that help with your anxiety when you're not feeling okay, doing those things, talking about it, having support around you, accessing a support group or speaking to your neighbours or some person who you don't know that is neutral, but gaining that support and communicating what's going on.
Start by recognising that you have been through a distressing or frightening experience which you will have a reaction to. Accept that you may not feel like your normal self for quite some time. Be kind to yourself if you can't function the way you normally would. Reach out and talk to someone if you need support. Try to maintain your normal routine, but allow yourself the time to rest if you need it.
So when we've experienced trauma, you can feel a tendency to want to isolate yourself, but and that's okay. Sometimes you do need to take time out for yourself and self-care. But if you find that you're spending lots of time on your own, you're not seeing friends and family like you normally would, that actually can, inadvertently make the trauma worse. So it's really important to stay connected with loved ones who you trust and who are supportive.
So the primary or the first point of managing trauma is developing some grounding strategies. So grounding strategies are sometimes referred to as mindfulness. Some people who aren't sure about the language might refer to it even as relaxation. We tend to take relaxation off the table because that can really make people who are feeling vulnerable more vulnerable. But grounding strategies are certainly the cornerstone of working therapeutically with someone. So finding the grounding strategies that are right for you. At the centre, we do that on a sensory basis. And there's some specific reasons around why we do that. What we know about impact of trauma and the triggers that happen is that the brain, frontal cortex, the front part of the brain where we do all our thinking, will disengage. And it can take like 20 minutes to come back online. So when someone's been triggered, it can take a long time to work through that. And there's no amount of thinking your way, when you've really peaked out, of thinking your way through it. So what we try and do here is recognise that you can retrain your brain and create new neural pathways that allow you to shift your emotions back to that neutral state. A way of creating a neural pathway where your responses are not being pushed around by the trauma and you have a bit more control over where your emotions are at. I mean, at that point, you're not going to remember to do any of those things. Your brain is in fight, flight, freeze mode or appease mode, and it's about survival. So it's being easy on yourself, recognising that that's normal and it's an appropriate response for a brain to do when it feels threatened.
Listen to them. Find out what do they need, not what you think they need. Find out what's going to work for them and how can you best support them. Listen to them. Provide that space of just sitting with them and being.
Communicate to that individual that you understand the impact that the trauma has had on them or how deeply they are affected, and express kindness, compassion and understanding. Educate yourself about the impacts of trauma, the possible symptoms and warning signs. And finally, most importantly, don't force someone to talk if they're not ready, as this can be quite distressing and triggering.
It's really important, listening. People feeling heard is really important. I know, in Australian culture we do tend to be a bit of, pull your socks up and it'll be okay. And also people tend to dismiss people's trauma sometimes. Oh, there's people worse off than you. But it never really helps anyone to say there's people worse off than you, because it's really dismissive. So listening, being supportive and being flexible about the way you provide support, and also getting support for yourself if you're finding that you're having trouble supporting your loved one that's experiencing trauma.
Knowledge is power. So the more information we have, the more prepared we can be. But there's no magical answer around how can we prepare for for trauma, because it is that unexpected space. We don't know how we're going to respond, and we don't know what's around the corner. So if we do know ourselves, and we do know what is going to work for us and what's not, and how do we then use that information to prepare, that's how we get ready for it.
Ways in which you can increase emotional resilience for future emergencies and disasters by first understanding that community resilience is created by individual resilience. We can empower ourselves to perceive adversaries as only being temporary. So ways that we can foster and improve our own individual resilience is firstly by reaching out and fostering close social supports and connections with families and friends so that we can turn to them during hard times. Developing our problem-solving abilities, trying to see ourselves as being resilient as opposed to being a victim. It may also include engaging in first aid courses or developing a disaster plan to create a sense of preparedness for future disasters or emergencies.
Well, being prepared can come into it, but there's a balance between being prepared and being hyper-vigilant, I guess, around what's happened. You can also make sure that you're well connected in the community. So I'm thinking specifically of a bushfire, that, if you've already experienced that one time before, there might be more planning and more support in the community that you can reach out for.
I think learning the skills is important, and when you have some skills around regulating your emotions, it starts to build resilience. Having a positive outlook, and having experiences that can support that is one of those ways. It might be having a support system around you that can allow you to experience those things and know that it's going to be okay.